Hello and welcome to Toy Polloi 2, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how I recreated the James Bond classic gun barrel intro to work as one of the new Toy Polloi intros over on my main channel. It was a really fun project and a really interesting process because you have to try and work out how they would have done things back in the 70s but using modern technology. So let me talk you through the process and I'll show you everything I did to create this new intro. The first thing to do, of course, is actually find a version of the intro that I like, and the one I chose was from James Bond's Moonraker, which is one of my favourite of the Bond movies. I found a version of that on YouTube, downloaded it and loaded it into Hitfilm, and then created a composite shot to work on top of. This means I can have the clip running in the background and I can work on top of it with my own new artwork. We start with the classic dot moving from the left to the right. This then expands to be the inside of the gun barrel with James Bond walking to the left. He turns and fires, blood drips down from the ceiling, and then the gun barrel moves around a bit until it moves off to one corner. It's a fairly simple sequence, or it looks like a fairly simple sequence, but it's actually quite complicated to create. To create this sequence I needed 3 flat images, so I headed into Photoshop to start creating those. The first one you see is the tab hole, and that's a simple thing to create because I can just cut that straight off of my logo, and that really links it into the branding for my channel. For the blood dripping down, I just created a red oblong and used the wave feature in Photoshop to create a wave to the bottom of it. I then also added some dark shading around the edge of it just to make it look a little bit more interesting. Probably the most complicated thing to create was the gun barrel, and for that I actually headed into 3D Studio Max and created a model which I then rendered out, took that back into Photoshop and did a little bit more work on it, and the end result I got something that looks pretty close to what they used in the original, which I would imagine is a photograph down a gun barrel, but now this is themed to look like the tab hole of my logo. I was really quite pleased with how this turned out, and I knew that it would work very well by the time we started to animate it. Once I got these 3 files I could head back into Hitfilm and start doing the animation. Now that we have those elements, we can start creating the logo. So the first thing I want to do is to recreate the moving dot from left to right. And for that, I'm going to be using the tab hole that I've created. I dragged that in as a new layer. So onto that, I added a quick animation, just moving it from left to right. Once it reaches the rightmost point, it then scales up to fill the screen. So let's look at that. You can see that's fairly simple, but it does exactly the same thing as the original one. The original one also has dots that are left behind. So all I did for that was duplicate this layer at key points, remove the animation so the dots appear, and then added a quick fade to them so they fade off. The original one doesn't have them fading off, but I thought it looked a little bit neater with them fading off. So let's unhide these layers and I'll play you the sequence again with those in place. I'm going to hide the original James Bond one just so you can see these on their own. So as you can see, that's starting to look like the sequence. It's a very simple setup. We've got one element that moves and then 6 elements that appear and disappear behind it. Very simple, but very effective. The next stage is to add the moving gun barrel part. So if I just hide all of those layers, and we'll unhide the original James Bond sequence as well. So you can see what happens is that the circle scales up, and as it scales up, it sort of unhides the internals of the gun barrel. So again, I brought in the gun barrel that I'd created in Photoshop and 3ds Max, brought it in as a new layer. So if I just unhide that, so you can see all I've done is I've made that layer appear. In fact, I've used a mask on that layer just to make it sort of have a little fade around the edge of it. If I click on it, you can see that the mask appears and we've just got this sort of oval shape with a little bit of a fade, and that just scales up over a few frames. Then again, I've added the same sort of animation, moving it left to right, and that's why I bring in the original version of the Bond animation, because I can sort of copy what it does by just moving my thing on top of it and adding keyframes where needed. So if I show you the keyframes for this animation, you can see these are the keyframes of it moving. It sort of moves from left into the center, it then stops, and after James Bond shoots, it then starts to move. So we've got a few keyframes of it just moving left and right, and then finally it moves down to the bottom right hand corner. It's a very simple sequence, but you want to get it right because I think everybody knows how this James Bond sequence looks. So there are the sort of 2 key elements of this. There are a couple of other layers just to add some little effects and things like that, but that's the basis of this whole animation. And if I unhide all of these lower layers, you can see that we've actually got pretty close to the original sequence now. The next key part of this sequence is actually the blood moving down the screen. We've already created that image in Photoshop, so I brought that in as a new layer, which you can see here, and I've done a little bit of animation on that. You can see at the start it is right off the top of the screen, and by this keyframe it's been moved all the way down to the bottom. So as we scroll through, you can see that the blood moves down the screen. I've set the blend mode on this layer to be additive so that it adds to the background. You get a really nice vibrant red blood effect. I also thought it looked a little bit static when it came down, so I've added an effect to this layer called Wave, which just adds a little bit of a ripple to it, so it looks like it's waving a bit as it slides down the screen, and I think it gives it that more sort of bloody effect like the original James Bond film had. And there you go, that really is the main key elements to this sequence. We have the dots moving left to right, we have the gun barrel expanding up and moving around, and then when James Bond shoots we have the blood coming down. But we are missing a really key part, and that is James Bond in the middle. And I've been thinking for quite a long time how I was going to do this, and then it finally came to me that I could just use an action figure, and rather than moving it left to right, all I needed to do was actually hold it in the middle of the screen and bob it up and down, making it look like it was walking. Then I could add the motion in Hitfilm. So let's take a look at the footage I shot of my Darth Vader figure moving along and turning, and then I'll show you what I did with it. So once I've got that footage, I then brought it into Hitfilm and I've scaled it down a bit and started to animate it. So we're moving Darth Vader from right to left, and because of the bobbing up and down motion, it actually looks like he's starting to walk. I've done a very quick edit here in the middle because as he turns, I wanted his arm to be raised. So at that point, I raised his arm and I've just sort of cut the footage so it looks like he is turning and his arm jumps up. I've then taken a screen grab of the final frame of the sequence and then just held it, because actually what you want is him to turn, raise his arm and then stay completely static. So let me show you those sequences now with the extra motion added. It's really quite convincing, and considering I'm literally just bobbing him up and down, I think that works exceptionally well, and I was very pleased with how this turned out for my first go at sort of messing around with adding a real bit of footage to this animation. But obviously you can see we've got a lot of excess stuff around, there's a lot of black around him, so I added a new plane and made it a mask, and you can see that blocks off most of it. The little bit of black that we've got there at the bottom doesn't matter because that is actually hidden by the gun barrel. So now if I play the sequence, you'll see it looks like he's walking along a white background and then he turns and fires. It's a very simple thing to do, but it's very effective. So we can now start putting all of these things together and you'll see the final sequence. If I unhide all of these layers again, right up to the top, and play the sequence, you'll get the feeling for the whole thing. It looks like a really simple sequence when you first look at it, but when you start to break it down, you can see how many layers and pieces are involved in recreating the original James Bond look. I did one final grade layer over the top just to add a bit of a vignette and some fading around the edge. You can add as many effects as you want in Hitfilm. Sometimes you can go a bit far, but I try and keep everything quite subtle on this. Once I was happy with this sequence, I could then add my final sort of Toy Polloi logo bit to the end and also add some sound effects. I found quite a lot of sound effects online, and I also found on YouTube they had a James Bond style piece of music, which is what I used on the final sequence. So let me show you the final sequence with all of those effects added together and all of the music added.
Welcome to Toy Polloi.
And there you go, that is it. That is the whole sequence. It took me about 2 days to create this because I wasn't sure how I was going to go about it. I spent the first day trying to work out how to create these static elements, the dots moving left to right and then the gun barrel, and creating all of the artwork, because actually creating the artwork of the internal of the barrel took me a little while to work out as well, to get all of the curves and lines on it to make it actually look like it was a gun barrel rather than just a tunnel with a texture on it. On the second day I worked out how I was going to actually get a character into this and how to animate Darth Vader so that he would look look right and work within the rest of the sequence. And I'm really pleased with how this all came together. Sometimes these things come together really quickly. 2 days is actually not too bad for a project like this. It was fun to work on and it really stretched my sort of abilities and skills, and I think the end results really show that it was worth all of that effort. So hopefully this video has been of interest to you. If it has, then make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the bell to be notified each time I upload a new video. And if you've really enjoyed it, then head on over to my main channel Toy Polloi and subscribe there as well. And thanks for watching.